I thought the first thing I should do, since I'm one of your candidates to be nominated for president, and willing to do that, is to tell you more about myself than you likely know. If you're like me, you're so busy every day you don't have time to really look into things. But my background is pretty much small town background. I was born in a town of 300, grew up in a town of 500, and live in a town of 600. So not far from where I grew up and I was born. I think I live about 18 miles from where I was born and about 8 miles from where I grew up most of the time. On the other hand, I also have a sort of a second life where I live in Henderson, Nevada, and enjoy my time out there as well. I went to a school that had 6 students per grade, 3 grades per room. Entertainment was in the morning was how many times you could pat a potbelly stove that was glowing red hot without getting burned. So it was very small. I graduated the top 1/3 of that class, second out of 6. I will say that I went on to high school that graduated 119. I finished second to the same girl again. So I managed to finish second out of 119 and second out of 6. But I learned later on that teaching multiple classes in one room is actually considered to be a good way to teach. We ended up being the teacher many times. A lot of times the 6th grade would teach the 4th grade while the teacher was teaching the 5th grade. And as they say, there's no better way to learn than to teach. So it was a good experience. We always lined up outside and said the prayer and said the Pledge of Allegiance and sang America the Beautiful and sang West Virginia Hills. So we grew up true blue Americans to the extreme, and a very military family. My brother has a Bronze Star from Hamburger Hill. My uncle has medals from World War II. So we've been pretty active in every aspect of what we viewed America as being. I guess going through school, I managed to get into college and worked in the coal mine to get through college and pay the tuition. Went on to work in the food business for about 10 years. And in 40 years of working, I never missed a promotion in 40 years. I was on the board of the largest construction company in the United States and on the board of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So I told a story when I was running for Senate in West Virginia that I'm a little bit unique, and I told this, I think, to some of you in May. I was born into a poorhouse, learned what a Sears Roebuck catalog was in an outhouse, took my first shower at 18 years old in a coal mine bathhouse, first time I'd ever seen a shower, and eventually made it to the rich house, to dinner at the White House, and then they put me in the big house. So I can tell my whole history in the amount of houses I've lived in, and in doing that, I think I'm uniquely qualified. And I would have won the race in West Virginia, except for circumstances that some of you know about. But because of that, I can relate to most anybody that I talk to. I understand what it is to be falsely incarcerated. I also understand what it is to be on major boards and make in 1 year $20 million. So I understand what it is to be on each side of that. The other thing I understand is the government interferes with your life no matter which of those tranches you're in, no matter which of those houses you're in at the time. And because of that, I think that people in this room are extremely interested in liberty. Liberty is, after all, what it's really all about. We refer to the first 10 amendments or the Bill of Rights. I don't think a lot of people understand that those are our human rights. They're rights that are supposed to be not only instilled in Americans, but instilled throughout the world. I wanted to use some examples to tell you about how far we are from actually having the Constitution. Yesterday, Richard or Trent or somebody spoke about the fact that Russia has a better human rights or constitution than we do. I can tell you that we don't have the rights that we think we do, as I learned during my trial. We don't have the right to recross that we're guaranteed by the Constitution. We don't have the right to fair jury instructions. We don't have the right to face our accusers. We don't have the right to even a standard definition of beyond a reasonable doubt. When I was first arraigned, one of the constitutional amendments is about how much bail, excessive bail, shall not be set. They actually set a $5 million bail on my charges on the basis that my free speech troubled the United States, which I thought was quite remarkable, that they would openly admit in court that you would be held under house arrest and be placed under a $5 million bond because your free speech troubled the United States. The other things that might surprise you during the trial is I was charged with a crime that didn't exist, which was employees telling each other or miners telling each other that someone had arrived at the mine like federal inspectors. There is no law that says that, but by using the word conspiracy, they say you conspired by doing that in order to hide mine safety violations. So they make up the law, which is really not on the books. If you're not aware of it, the conspiracy law is one of the worst laws in the country, because you can actually just sit and talk to somebody about robbing a bank, and you don't have to ever even try to rob the bank. You're guilty of conspiracy. But another example of a recross is that in my case, the lead witness, they put in 24 exhibits on redirect, they call it, and would not allow a recross. They sent the jury back 2 to 3 times to reconsider the fact that they were deadlocked, which they're not supposed to do under the Allen Bill. It ended up with a 97-page report being developed by what's called the Office of Professional Responsibility, which outlined all the prosecution misconduct, and yet at the end of that report, they conclude that the prosecution didn't do anything intentionally wrong. But the update on that case is it's a misdemeanor. Convicted of a misdemeanor, it's been now going on 5 years, I think just past 5 years, so the idea that you got a speedy trial process is pretty well blown out the water too. But the good news is that the magistrate judge, and it's very complicated, but there's a federal magistrate judge that works basically for the federal trial judge, and we filed a petition 18 months ago that they should void the conviction because of prosecution misconduct. And the magistrate judge working for the trial judge has now recommended that the misdemeanor be voided. That is probably the first time in history that a misdemeanor has been fought for 5 years and then been voided by the government because of misbehavior. And so that's the reason I wrote the pamphlet and speak of myself as American political prisoner. It's really impossible for anyone to put themselves in the shoes of facing 30 years in prison and sitting in a courtroom for 6 weeks and hearing conversations go on like goes on in a courtroom. I mean, they stacked the audience with members of the families of the explosion that killed 29 people at one of the mines that Massey owned. They gave those people special seating privileges, and they talked routinely about the rights of the victims' families. The problem was I wasn't charged with anything that had anything to do with any victims other than the Security and Exchange Commission. So it was a strange situation that there was talk constantly by the judge about the victims and the victims' families, and yet there was no discussion allowed about the explosion. And so you couldn't defend yourself against the claim that you had caused the explosion, but yet it was as the lawyers like to call it, the elephant in the room. But you learn so much during that process, I wouldn't want to go through it again. But I know more about the violations of law under the Constitution, more about the way prisons are run, and more about the, if you will, the demeanor of human beings and the behavior of human beings than I ever cared to know about. It's really quite remarkable. In an indictment, most criminal lawyers in the country know that they can indict anybody. In fact, the common thing talked about in the legal profession is that they can indict a ham sandwich. Once they indict you, you don't have any of the constitutional rights. I was strip searched 44 times during the year I was in prison. They come in, they take your locker apart and everything. My house was searched 12 times, including both the house in West Virginia and the one in Nevada. They took every gun, every protection I had, and told the public that they had taken all my guns, and yet they kept me surrounded by armed FBI agents while I was at court. I thought, you're sending me back to the house under house arrest out in the country with nowhere, with no protection, but you act like you're going to protect me during the courtroom. But it was an experience that you really can't give anybody the flavor for. But it derived from the UBB coal mine explosion, which is a story in itself. When Obama got elected, the rule is that the government sets parameters or requirements for air ventilation, for roof control, for amount of rock dust. They set the law as far as what you have to achieve. But they have no right to tell you how to achieve it. But under Obama, that changed. He put together a bunch of lawyers, and they would come in and not approve anything that you wanted approved. They would only approve what they wanted. So while they would still claim that you were not, that you were responsible for and had made the mine plan or the ventilation plan, they were in fact dictating what that would be. And going back to my background a little bit, since I had, in the union's eyes, destroyed United Mine Workers, and since the United Mine Workers president was president of the AFL-CIO, and since he was the number one contributor through the AFL-CIO to Obama, and since he was the most frequent visitor to the White House, all that the president likely heard was that Don Blankenship is a bad guy. But the truth of the matter is, my battles with the union derived from not willing to make false promises to the workers. The union always wanted us to promise medical benefits, retiree benefits, and pension benefits that weren't affordable. And when I refused to do that, they began to shoot people. They hospitalized in 1985 alone 91 of the Massey workers, and they killed 2, and they shot 2 family members. In fact, they shot into the house and badly wounded one of the replacement workers' wives. So we replaced all these people, and there was a paid assassin from Ohio named Arnold Heitland, which, if I had all day, I could tell you all kinds of stories. I corresponded with him by letter and tried to get him to tell me who paid him to kill our truck driver, and we had quite a bit of correspondence about it. He finally backed out because he was never tried for murder. He was tried for interfering with the transport of an energy source across state lines and got 25 years. So that was in '85, and he got out in 2010. But I corresponded with him some while he was in prison and some after he got out of prison, trying to get him to tell me who paid him, but he wouldn't do it because the statute hadn't run on murder, and he'd never been tried for murder. So, but a lot of times it was just local guys. One of them named Bushwhacker, which I thought was an appropriate nickname for. He shot a guy 27 times. But to give you an idea how people think, some of these guys, when they got out of prison, called and asked me for a job. So they don't see the errors of their ways. It's really crazy. But they're very violent. Cecil Roberts and Richard Trumpka. Trumpka's now head of the AFL-CIO. Have me number 1 on their list. I tell everybody sometimes you can tell more about a person by who hates him than you can by who likes him. And Tom Perez, who's president of the Democratic Party, was so tickled when I got indicted that we have emails where he was doing everything he could to get the phone number of the prosecutor so he could call and congratulate him on indicting me. But to give you an idea, the trial went on for 6 weeks. I was found guilty of a misdemeanor, not guilty of 3 felonies, and only guilty of the misdemeanor because they wouldn't let the jury go home, and Christmas was approaching. It was December the 3rd. And so the prosecutors immediately went to 60 Minutes and declared that I was like a drug kingpin running a criminal enterprise, even though they had spent 5 years investigating me and only been able to convict me of a misdemeanor. So I spent a year at Taft Prison, the only misdemeanor out of 2,400 prisoners. And after I got out of there, I went to the halfway house in Las Vegas. And about 4 months before, I guess it was 6 months before I was scheduled to be released from the halfway house, I launched a campaign for the U.S. Senate seat in the 2018 May primary. Most everybody thought I was crazy. They realized that I had personally converted West Virginia from blue to red. I had beaten the West Virginia bond where they wanted to go $5.5 billion in debt because the then governor wanted to give a lot of money to attorneys. I had elected a judge in 2004. That was the first Republican judge ever elected in West Virginia in 80 years, since 1920, 84 years actually. And I had beaten the food tax and had it eliminated. So there was a certain amount of fear that Blankenship might be able to achieve something when he began to run for U.S. Senate. But generally, the press thought it was impossible to win, which, by the way, anybody in here know who Matthew Lyon was? Matthew Lyon is the only guy that won a U.S. Senate seat from prison. So I was nearly the second one to win a U.S. Senate seat from a halfway house. But Matthew Lyon was put in prison for freedom of speech. It was about 1800, I think. And so it wasn't too long after the Revolutionary War. And he went out and started criticizing President Adams because he was reestablishing a relationship with England on trade. And a lot of the people that thought we should be loyal to the French because of their help during the war got offended. And I think they were called a Federalist, but I'm not sure. Anyway, they started arresting people. They put like 15 people in prison for criticizing the federal government just 24 years after the Constitution was written. And it was called the Sedition Act. They passed what was called the Sedition Act, which was that you couldn't cause the public to think less of the government. You couldn't go out and critique the government to the point that the public became disenchanted with the government. And that's basically what the public figure law is. As far as I know, I'm the only person up here that has less free speech rights than you do. But once you're named a public figure, they can say about you whatever they want to say and feel free based on common law through the courts that because you're a public figure, you can be criticized. But the continuation of that story is that I was way behind in the polls on the election. I think I was down like 40 points when the first polls, because it's hard to win from a halfway house. But as I began to tell the story, I first started off telling the story about the explosion, and it was the government that actually caused it and actually did a documentary about it and all that. But as we got about 3 months into it, I began to pick up momentum. And by March the 15th, just whatever that was, I guess that was for about 7-8 weeks before the election, the National Republican Senatorial Committee did a poll when we were dead even. Actually, I was down 25 to 24 to the leader, and the third guy was 20, and then the rest of it was undecided. So we were down 1 point. The National Republican Senatorial Committee, including Mitch McConnell, got excited and got so excited that they went out of their mind, I think. They first of all had a meeting in McConnell's office, which is illegal, and decided that they would draft a menu list of items to stop Blankenship. On that list was a lot of things, but obviously one of those things was to call me a felon. And so they called me a felon on national television 100 times in the week before the election, including Judge Napolitano calling me, saying that I went to prison for manslaughter. And so it's pretty hard to win when the public thinks you're guilty of manslaughter. So following that, I sued them all, and I've got them sued now for $12 billion. Most people think that's an outrageous amount, but we sold the company that I ran for $7 billion. It was worth $200 million when I became the president. So it's not an outrageous amount if you look at what could be done. But most importantly, the biggest part of that is punitives. The argument is that if the press is going to do what Mitch McConnell and the Republicans want them to do and call leading candidates for the U.S. Senate, which, by the way, I was up 18 points at the time they decided to start calling me a felon, because they panicked even more when they saw that calling me a bigot or a racist wasn't working. Karl Rove was taken to the television and saying I was an imbecile, a moron. I don't know what all words he used, a racist and so forth. And the racist thing, they started that because I had said that McConnell should not be involved in issues involving China because his wife and his family are involved with China. His sister-in-law is on the Bank of China board, and his father-in-law has special contracts with China for shipping products in his ships, and he gets free financing of those ships from China. But anyway, having said that, they decided that calling me a racist would be a good idea. But when racists and other slanders didn't work, they began to call me a felon, and even having gone to prison for manslaughter. I doubt there's ever been a more clear evidence of interference or sabotage of a federal election. It's far more impactful for Judge Napolitano or Stephanie Hamill, Chris Hayes got in the act, I don't know, this Elizabeth Cupp that's on CNN. I mean, it was like a storm of the fact I was a felon. One of the little details of it, I had a common friend with Judge Napolitano, and I had him call Napolitano on the 25th after he had said what he said on the 24th or something about those dates, and tell him that I was not a felon and I did not go to prison for manslaughter, and he needed to apologize. Napolitano emailed back the next day that he realized he was wrong and he would fix it on Monday, which would have been somewhere 9 days before the election. But he didn't do it. He waited till 2 weeks until after the election before he apologized for having said I was a felon. And then he also said that, that he never did mention the manslaughter again. He never apologized for the manslaughter part. But there could never have been anything more outrageous than what went on during that election. And it's so hypocritical and so crazy that while Congress is arguing what Russian influence or Ukrainian influence there might have been, but to give you an idea of how big this is, when they arrested the 2 Ukrainians the other day, the only U.S. Senate candidate who received money from those 2 arrested Ukrainians was my opponent in a general election. And in the primary election, he was Patrick Morrissey. So they made a menu list of items to stop Blankenship. They called me every name they could. They couldn't stop me. They then began to say that I was a felon and went to prison for manslaughter. They then attracted money from Ukrainians, and they finally beat us. So it's not exactly what you'd call a fair election process. I think we still would have beat them if the president and his son hadn't come out. The president's son even came out on the Friday before the election and said that I was a felon. And then the president himself came out the day before the election and said that people should not vote for me because I can't win. I tweeted yesterday that I guess the president figured out that somebody guilty of manslaughter couldn't win. But it's remarkable the effort that they went to prevent my being in the U.S. Senate. And this chronologically is a little backward, but the reason that they did that, in my opinion, is more than the fact that I'm Trumpier than Trump. And it comes to policy. Hopefully I got a lot better demeanor and a lot better manners and a lot more morals than Trump has. But on the issues, I'm pretty much in alignment with him. In fact, I did a documentary, if you have the time to watch it, that I mentioned before in May, called Regcession, which is a word I trademarked spelled Regcession. And you can see it either on YouTube or my website. But the point it makes is that we have to secure our borders. We have to deal with the debt. We have to detach ourselves from foreign powers and from trying to police the world. And many of the same things that Trump alleges to support. I'm actually a big supporter of Trump. I was the largest donor in the history of the Republican Party. And to Frank's point that he's been making up here about ballot access, the history of West Virginia, and I'm jumping around some, but the history of West Virginia politically is divided into 3 60-year periods or so. The first 60 years after it was formed, it was 100% Republican. And that was natural because Lincoln made it a state probably outside the bounds of the Constitution, but West Virginia was separated from Virginia, and Abraham Lincoln was Republican, and he did that separation. So between 1863 and 1920, West Virginia was almost 100% Republican. In 1920, the mine wars began, and basically the Union was thrown out of company homes, and people had a lot of sympathy for the Union and the strength of Mother Jones and John L. Lewis and so forth. Went to such levels that they controlled the politics until I came along in 1990 or so. We had the 1985 strike at the very same town, which is called Matewan, of which there's a movie that the Matewan Massacre occurred. And the Matewan Massacre and the Union uprising led to the only time that American Air Force or the American military ever dropped bombs on American citizens in Logan County, West Virginia. So Billy Mitchell himself was involved in the raid to stop the miners' uprising from having been evicted from their homes. Anyway, that's 60 years from the time of the Civil War to that uprising was Republican. The next 60 or so years was Democrat. And then when we had the strike in 85, it sort of disarmed the unions and lowered their power and their influence, and we began to drift back toward being a Republican state until we're now probably the state House, the state Senate, the governor's office, and I think 60% of the Supreme Court is Republican, even though they don't designate themselves anymore as Republican. So I've been around in a lot of history. I've been shot at a few times. Literally, I've had 11 bullet holes in my office during the 85 strike, 2 in my cars. I had 3 cars totaled while I was in them and didn't even wreck. So they're destroyed with sledgehammers and ball bats and other devices. So I think probably more than anybody in the country, at least as anybody that's not been in the military, I appreciate the need for this Constitution more so than most people. I've been in 3 instances where I've been involved in using the Constitution. I was interested in what Richard said the other night, that sometimes the lawyers make it too complicated. You can't tax people unless you return the money to the states, and the 30,000 people per rep. Most people take things that are in the Constitution as not real because you can't use the Constitution to win, and most of the time that's the case. But to give you an idea of how simple it can sometimes be, the Massey company that I ran was the highest payer of what they call black lung excise tax for 30 years. But the Constitution says in Article 1 that, quote, no state or that the government shall not levy a tax on any exported articles. And so they had levied $1.10 per ton of coal tax on coal leaving the United States, and it was only on coal leaving the United States, and the purpose of it was to fund the black lung accounts of the miners. So it passed, and it was on the books forever. Our company had probably paid $300 or $400 million in this tax. The industry had paid billions of dollars. And some lawyer came up with this idea that says in the Constitution you can't do this. And everybody just laughed him off. It might say that in the Constitution, but we've been paying this for decades. You can't get rid of it. They filed just a few-page claim to the courts. And lo and behold, the courts ruled that it was unconstitutional, and they made them give all the money back. It was incredible what can happen. Another thing I was involved in was what happened in the 1920 that caused the Matewan Massacre and all the shootings and the Billy Mitchell bombing American citizens was, as I said, the eviction of people from their homes. They were actually company homes, and the miners lived in company homes, and when they went on strike, the companies had them evicted. So West Virginia passed a law following that said that you could trespass during a union strike. And the union would use that because the idea was that you'd be able to stay in your home in 1920 even if you were on strike because you had the right to trespass. But what happened when we came along, the union began to use that to occupy the mine property. So the pickets would actually take the property from the coal company and go inside the prep plants with guns and stay there and not let the company operate their own property. So crazy Blankenship files this claim that you can't do that because it's unconstitutional. All the lawyers thought we were crazy. Turns out the state had to pay us $1 million. All the union had to be removed, and they declared the law unconstitutional, and West Virginia had to void the law. So sometimes the Constitution does work. So I've been involved in a few. Another one that I was involved in was West Virginia. Of course, as I said earlier, was a blue state. We wanted to turn it to red. And I formed a group called For the Sake of the Kids. So every time it came to the end of an ad, it would say paid for in the sake of the kids. And the government took exception to that, and they tried to stop me. They passed a law in West Virginia that you couldn't form an organization that had a misnomer in the title, that I wasn't doing what I was doing for the sake of the kids, when in fact I was, because we were trying to defeat a judge that had released a pedophile after 35 days of a 35-year sentence. So we won the election, but we also won the case in that the government ruled that the state could not pass a law that prohibited free speech. So there's been several times that I've been involved in issues that related to the Constitution where the Constitution did prevail. This public figure thing, if you're not familiar with it, is crazy. If you are well known, you have a voice, you run TV ads, or you've run for office, they declare you a, quote, public figure. And because of that, they can, as I said earlier, say things about you. So that is one of the biggest reasons I sued the media networks, was to have them challenge me on whether they can call me a felon because I'm a public figure. And sure enough, they're trying to defend the case on that basis in many instances, that they, as the free press, have the right to say things about you that they can't say about others. It's ironic because Matthew Lyon, that went to prison in 1800 or so, it was because he was criticizing the government that they put him in prison. But that's what caused, ultimately, Matthew Lyon's willingness to go to prison for his free speech is actually what caused the press to have such extreme free speech. Because they realized the First Amendment prohibited that, but they gave the press the ability to say most anything they want to say. But the question is going to be in the lawsuit that I filed is whether the press can say things that are untrue about candidates for office, particularly leading candidates for federal office. The other problem that the defendants have, which includes CNN, NBC, Fox, Napolitano, and all the individuals, there's 70 different ones actually that are defendants. The problem they're going to have is that West Virginia law has special statutes in it that prohibits a candidate for office from being called a criminal, a felon, or a misdemeanor unless they're in fact guilty. There was one case where a guy had been convicted of 3 felonies, and they called him a 5-time felon, and the defendants lost. The guy won the lawsuit even though he was a 3-time felon. They called him a 5-time felon. So they've got a particular problem in West Virginia with that issue. Let me jump over, because you're probably interested not only in my background but in my views on things, and say that, number one, I'm very much supportive of Trump and very much supportive of our liberties, and have had so much personal experience with it. I'm probably more committed and more determined than most people. But I believe that the Democratic Party has created a tremendous opportunity for the Constitution Party. The Democratic Party has left about a third of their people behind. About a third of the Democrats actually don't believe in abortion, and a high percentage of them don't believe, I don't know if any of them believe that climate change is the #1 problem in the world. Y'all laugh like I do. I can't believe a guy from Colorado, my apologies to the Colorado reps, but ran on the sole issue of climate change. Let me tell you quickly about climate change. As someone from the energy field, in 1980, the United States had 1 billion tons of coal production. The Chinese had 1 billion tons. Since then, the EPA has beat coal industry to death and driven it down to 600 to 700 million tons. They've ignored the fact that the Chinese are at 4.5 billion tons. So while they represent that their policies are helping with climate change or helping with environmental stewardship, the fact of the matter is that the use of coal worldwide is probably up 250% since they began that effort, the Clean Air Act. It's this type of hypocrisy where they claim to have a goal, but their actions don't match the goal. You're never going to lower CO2 emissions by a meaningful amount in the United States because we only represent 4% of the world's population. And so the ideal that you're going to put American manufacturing, everybody in the United States could disappear in the morning, and it would only be a short period of time before the CO2s were replaced. I'm on the record as saying that climate change is a hoax, but by that I don't mean that climate doesn't change or that man might have some influence on it, but the policies that are designed under the guise of affecting climate are totally wrong because U.S. motors, U.S. manufacturing and so forth is much cleaner. We spent billions of dollars as taxpayers getting rid of U.S. emissions of mercury and NOx and sulfur and arsenic and all kinds of true toxic materials, only to transfer all that production to Asia where they don't control anything. So at one point we were spending billions of dollars to get rid of the last 40 tons of mercury emissions from U.S. power plants, while the Chinese were still at 4,000 tons and nothing was being done. So you can tell it's a transfer of wealth. It's not a transfer of environmental stewardship. But I could talk about all those issues. I think the biggest point I'd like to make is what I call the 3Ds. The three biggest problems are dishonesty in government, the diversity, which is viewed or politically correct to say it's an advantage, it's actually a disadvantage, and drugs. Those three issues are much bigger in our lifetime than climate change will ever be. Dishonesty in government is going to have to be dealt with, generically speaking, by putting the same restrictions and requirements on our government that we put on our businesses. You're going to have honest reporting and audits and transparency and accountability. And government employees who destroy documents like they did during my trial and prosecution need to be as guilty of obstruction of justice as the regular citizens are. Drugs, when you lose 72,000 people a year to opiate drugs, and the drug industry is using contractors to camouflage the fact that they're distributing as many times 1.8 million drugs to one town in West Virginia of 600 people, you know that there's a problem. And it's not just the 72,000 that are dying, which is more than died in the whole Vietnam War. It's the fact that, how many of the car wrecks, how many of the people, how many of the shootings, how many other deaths are the result of drug abuse. And that is a huge problem. The diversity is the one that's hard to talk about because people would turn me into a racist again, back to a felon. But the diversity is derived from the same word as divisiveness. And while we all believe in have, I guess, been inundated with the need to get along with everybody and everything's accepted, every religion, every culture, every belief, we have to be honest with ourselves and realize it presents probably the biggest challenge this country has. I always refer back to having watched CNN during the Iraqi War. Somebody said it was 1998 or something. I don't remember exactly when it was. But they had a guest on CNN, and he spoke the whole time about how great it was that the United States had all this diversity and what an advantage it was and how many different skills and different people's minds, and that we were going to be the greatest country on earth because we had all this diversity. Well, the next speaker was talking about the Iraqi War because it was hot at the time. And he said in his segment just the opposite. He said the Iraqi country will never be one country under one government because of the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds will always kill each other. So the three different religions and the three different beliefs there couldn't be reconciled to be under one form of government or one government. And yet we're expected to have one form of government overseeing almost every religion in the world, every culture, and every belief. So that is a big problem. And my experience has been that you can't solve any problem until you recognize it's a problem, until you openly talk about it being a problem. I don't think any of us in this room are racist, but we are human beings, and human beings like to be at the family gatherings where they know their family, or they like to join clubs that are common to their cause, or the Constitution Party that's common to their beliefs. As a country, we no longer know what we are. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but at least I'm one step ahead of Democratic candidates. I recognize it as a challenge rather than as a solution. Speaking briefly on what Frank and I put as a title for this thing, solutions rather than arguments, the big point I would want to make there is that the Democrats have lost total contact with the huge percentage of people, like I said earlier. But like nobody in this country should be more against illegal immigration than people who are on fixed income or working for minimum wage or are concerned about having a good job. The reason is if you've got 6 million people that are working for cash and they're taking away medical benefits and they're requiring our education system to fund their education, then it's taking away from the people who most need more wages and better opportunities and better benefits. It's actually taking money from their benefits. So the Democratic Party should be for the wall. Whether you view the wall as electronic or brick or mortar, I'm not talking about that, but controlling the borders is more important to a high percentage of the Democratic Party than it is to people like myself. I mean, I'm sort of like the movie stars, I just go to another country. I don't have to worry about the borders of this country. But if you're living in Chicago and East St. Louis or somewhere, and you need better pay and better benefits, and you want security in your Social Security and your Medicare, you should be for the wall. Same thing is true on many of the other issues that they talk about on trade. If you're in a labor union and you're in the Democratic Party, most likely you're in the Democratic Party. The idea that you are not for Trump's trade policies is wrong, because the trade policies ought to be used to improve human rights around the world and improve environment, not just to keep people from launching nuclear weapons, but it should be, as Washington envisioned it, the source of income for our country, and it should keep the workforce on an even playing field with the rest of the world. I can tell you as a CPA and a mathematician that we can talk all we want, but if you have to pay a General Motors worker in Detroit $62 an hour, and you can pay one in Mexico $10 an hour, you're going to make the cars in Mexico. I know how business people think. That's the way it is. They're like water. They take the path of least resistance. So those issues, if you talked about the wall, or you talked about health care, or you talked about trade, whatever, someone standing on a Democratic platform during these debates that would truly show leadership and explain to the Democratic Party members why the policies being advocated by the other people on the stage are not the policies that will benefit the Democratic Party membership, I think they would probably get 30% of the vote in the morning, because that's the reason you're seeing New Jersey. Frank's expression, surprised at how many people in New Jersey have moved over, is that the millennial age, the young people who are the majority, have taken control and moved as far to the left in the Democratic Party. But Washington warned us against parties. Political parties are extremely dangerous. If you read his farewell address, it was one of his biggest concerns when he left office. And the thing that we miss, it reminds me of a story about a lawyer's dad had this big estate that he was trying to settle and to make millions of dollars a year, and he sent his son to college. His son got a law degree, and when he came back just a few days later, he came in and said, "I've settled the estate." He said, "We're done with it now." And his father said, "Well, you can't do that. That's how I put through all of you through college. It's how we make our money, is keeping the estate argument going and the will." And that's what the Republican and Democratic Party are doing. I mean, can you imagine, if you really think about it, stand up and arguing that illegal immigration should be okay? Once you put the word illegal in front of it, the rest of the conversation's over. I mean, it's, unless you don't believe in the rule of law. But that's where we are. I mean, we got a Democratic Party that thinks climate change is number one issue, that thinks illegal is constitutional, and that thinks that they should be against the interests of their own people, because that's where they get the money. They get the money from the movie stars, and the movie stars are probably living in Paris or somewhere. Anyway, I won't, be more than willing to take some questions if you've got them. I think I got about 3 minutes. Yeah. I can ask it for you. He was asking.
You were indicted on just one misdemeanor. How many actual charges did they try at one point to bring?
Yeah, I was found guilty of one misdemeanor. I was tried for 3 felonies, so I was facing 30 years in prison. 25 years of those 30 years were 13-word sentence and a release that I didn't write, which gives me another opportunity to explain something. They talk about double jeopardy. One letter, 25 years, 10 years because the public read it, 15 years because the Security and Exchange Commission read it. Nobody had any complaint about it except the prosecutors. But 25 years for 13 words that I didn't write nor edit.
Don, you were called a felon numerous times. Did they spell your name correctly?
Actually, my name is fine spelled anyway as long as you don't put a T where the P belongs at the end. I had that happen on a cruise ship one time.
But you also made reference to the common law. When you made that reference, were you referring to natural law or just law in general?
Law in general, the law that is created by the courts, which most of our law in this country, unfortunately, is created by the courts. One of the things that we need to have in the Congress is a committee that puts into law the clarity instead of the Supreme Court or other courts making it clear. To give you one that surprised me the most, I don't know what you know about is the definition of reasonable doubt. The jury is not supposed to be given a definition of beyond a reasonable doubt. But in my case, the judge decided to tell her that it was a preponderance of the evidence, that if I was more evidence I was guilty than I was innocent, which is an illegal definition. But the court has the right to decide what the definition of beyond a reasonable doubt is, but they're not supposed to give that definition, and yet on appeal, it was upheld that she could do that. My point being that most of our law is created by judges rather than by the legislature.
Thank you very much for sharing your story. It's very powerful to show the corruption of government. Could you just give us a quick rundown of a couple of issues? Abortion, gun control, maybe your foreign policy idea. I'd like to just have an idea of where you stand on those issues. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know whether to say I'm more in line with Trump or George Washington, but it's one or the other. But, you know, Washington did not believe that we should tangle ourselves up with foreign corporations, and I think that means we shouldn't be trying to police the world and we shouldn't be trying to solve the world's problems. So, you know, I'm pretty much on that side. If you watch the reg session, you'll see that I disagree with the Navy arguing or advertising our young men and our boys and our children, our daughters going to war in order to defend democracy around the world. They proudly proclaim that in these Navy commercials, but it's not our job and not your bill to defend democracy around the world. On abortion, I think that the government should have a Manhattan Project on abortion. That may sound strange, but I think that technology has solved a lot of problems, and I think that we can get a situation, if we would focus our attention on it, where we don't have to abort the child in order to end the pregnancy. And that's one thing that we should try to do. I'm probably the largest donor to the Right to Life in West Virginia history. I've donated to them probably for 20-some years, and I believe in the sanctity of life. But I also believe that it's going to be a hard battle to win. You were talking earlier about winning incrementally. I think we should be trying to get X number of weeks in there at least, and keep backing up what term of the pregnancy you can abort a child, but I'm very much opposed to aborting children. On guns, it's pretty simple. I think we have guns for the same reason that they took mine. If they come to get you, and they shouldn't be coming to get you, you better have your gun. So I should have my AK-47 or AR-15, whatever it is that I want. I think that when you start down that path, it's too dangerous. I do believe that people who are insane, people who are incapable, and so forth, and even that opens up a can of worms, though, that they can declare all of us insane. But I do believe that there are people who should not be allowed to have guns, but there aren't guns that we shouldn't be allowed to have. Okay.
Sir, you're seeking the Constitutional Party's presidential nomination, but you've praised Trump in a few areas. So what's the line, what's the niche that if you were the nominee, you'd be taking in favor of Constitution Party over the Republican nominee?
Well, I think that the thing that I offer is real life experience to be able to explain to people how important their constitutional rights are, and to be able to relate to anybody that's in any of these houses I talked about, whether you're in the poor house, the big house, or the rich house. I understand what the government's doing to you. So I think that's the reason that I was, got the lead in the U.S. Senate race before the national media was turned loose on me. It's the reason that I beat Robert Kennedy in a debate in about 2004, having to do with the environment. Pragmatism is very powerful, not just truth, but pragmatism. When people start talking about you should end all mining in the United States, and you start talking about what it means, they quickly decide that you shouldn't end all mining in the United States. I mean, the poor people, going back to Democratic Party positions, for example, about Elizabeth Warren doing away with fracking, there's not a person on minimum wage or even average wage in the United States that can afford their power bill if you do away with fracking. So it's a situation where most time people aren't thinking about what that means. Okay, whichever one.
Hey, Don. Al Pisano from North Carolina.
Hey, congratulations in North Carolina.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We worked hard for it. I appreciate it. Two questions for you as a presidential candidate. Where do you actually stand on red flag laws? And in foreign policy, where would you stand as far as the constitutionality of the War Powers Act?
Constitutionality of the War Powers Act. I don't know. I think that, again, the Constitution makes clear that it's supposed to be for the welfare of the United States and not to protect the welfare of people all over the world. So I'm pretty simple in the fact that I believe we need to be not only building a wall to protect our borders, but putting around ourselves the fact that we have to put ourselves first. There's a reason that when you're on an airplane, they tell you to put the oxygen on yourself before you put it on your kid. It is that you're not going to be alive to put it on your kid if you don't get it on yourself first. And that's my fundamental belief about our involvement in the rest of the world. When you're $22 trillion in debt and you have the problems that this country has, you need to take care of yourself. And that's the reason Trump wins, America first. And, I'm all behind that. Does that answer your question? The red flag law, I think I basically addressed that. I do think the only thing that I subscribe to at all in terms of gun control, everything else is out, is I do think that taking the time to make sure that you aren't crazy or aren't a person that's committed assaults with a weapon before they give you an AR-15 is reasonable. I do think it opens up Pandora's box, if you will, but I guess on balance, I come down on the side of the fact that we got to make sure that people that should not have guns don't have them. But outside of that, I don't think there ought to be any controls of any kind. I had 17 guns, and the day they indicted me, I didn't have any. That's the other thing you got to keep in mind is once they indict you, they don't have to convict you. They can indict you and keep you tied up in trial for 4 or 5 years and take everything you got. They can take your dogs, they can take your guns, they can search your property. I was strip searched 44 times in 1 year. So there's no limit to what they can do because they can indict anybody. Go ahead.
Hi. I just am shocked at your story and that I'm not up to date on it. But most importantly, what I'd like to know is how did you come to be here today? What led you to the Constitution Party? I'm stunned that you're here, and I'm grateful, and I thank God you are here.
Yeah,
I really mean that, but I'm amazed. I'd just like to know how you got here and how you became aware of us and why you're here. It's just shocking to me.
Well, if you think about it, somebody said earlier that the Republican Party left them, so I'm clearly not a Democrat, and I'm clearly not a Republican, so I got here almost by default. But I don't know where to go. It's like, if they take your home away, you take the first shelter you can find. And, of course, I looked at the Constitution Party. I read about what it stands for. I believe in what it stands for. I do think that we have to broaden our appeal if we're going to be effective. We're in a situation where we don't want to compromise our beliefs and our morals, but we have to guard against the fact that we limit who's willing to be part of the party. But having grown the Republican Party from practically non-existent to the majority in West Virginia, I know how you do that. And it's not easy because Frank and I talked about it before. When I put a Republican on every ballot in West Virginia personally in 2006, when probably half of the ballots didn't have a Republican on it. And I just hired this guy to go around and find somebody to put anybody's name on it so that they would be a Republican listed for county clerk or for House of Representatives or whatever it was. And of course, people got accustomed to seeing the Republican Party. We didn't win hardly. In fact, I think we won 2 elections that they didn't think we would win out of 100 the first time we did it. But whatever that was, 2006 and 2016, they took majority control of the West Virginia legislature, governor's office, Supreme Court, and everything. So it can be done, but it's done incrementally. It's not going to be done overnight. And we have to appeal to a large audience. And I think that you'd be surprised. There's so many people. The reason Trump won is there's so many people believe what they don't say. It's hard to figure out what the public really thinks because they're shell-shocked from being told that they're a racist or they're a bad person if they say this or say that. But somewhere in the back of their mind, there's a lot of Archie Bunker type thinkers that think that, the country has to come first and the American worker has to come first and so forth and so on. So I'm a strong believer in leading as opposed to finding the warm spot and winning an election. And because I think if you're just going to find a warm spot and win an election, you really didn't achieve anything anyway. You got to provide leadership as to what we want this country to be.
Great answer so far. How about Trump's trade war with China?
Well, yeah. The only thing I would say about the trade war, Frank, is that it's not really a trade war. China has no opportunity to win that war. I was in business all my life. The customer always wins, and we're the customer. China's the supplier. Any supplier that's ever tried to beat its customer lost.